Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar, the Clean Arctic Alliance briefing for Pre-MEPC 82. We will just wait 1 or 2 minutes for people to let in, to come in to this webinar, and then we'll proceed. So welcome to this event, the Clean Arctic Alliance's Pre-MEPC 82 briefing. We have more than 50 people coming in now, and there's still people entering the room. So I think it's, we could start right now. So hello again. Welcome to this Clean Arctic Alliance's Pre-MEPC 82 briefing. Everything you need to know on black carbon, greenhouse gases, scrubbers, noise, plastics, and other shipping impacts. My name is Elko Leemans. I'm a technical advisor to the Clean Arctic Alliance, and I will be moderating today. First of all, a couple of housekeeping matters. This event will be recorded and made available later for those unable to join today. And secondly, if you have any questions, could you please indicate to which speaker the question is directed and submit it via the Zoom Q&A option, which should be near the bottom of your screen. We will endeavor to answer your questions during a Q&A session at the end of the briefing, but we have a large number of speakers, and it might be that we run out of time. If so, you can follow up with us after the webinar. So about the webinar, in under the 2 weeks, the 82nd session of the International Maritime Organization's Marine Environment Protection Committee will meet at the IMO headquarters in London to discuss and negotiate new measures to address a wide range of environmental protection measures, including a number that are of particular relevance to the protection of the Arctic. Important deliberations on measures to deliver the IMO's greenhouse gas strategy and kickstart shipping decarbonization will be the focus of an intersessional working group next week, and will be a major focus at the MEPC too. But there are other important issues on the agenda too, including emissions of black carbon, the use of scrubbers and discharge of scrubber wastewater, and underwater noise. So now we have a great lineup today to provide a snapshot of what MEPC 82 will be trying to achieve and what we would like to see come out of the meeting. And I will introduce all the speakers in a moment, and after the short interventions, we will have a short Q&A session. So again, please submit questions at any time in the Q&A session, and a selection will be put to the speakers once they have all spoken. We will start with Bill Hemmings, a technical advisor to the Clean Arctic Alliance, who will speak on air pollution and particularly on emissions of black carbon. Kar Christensen of Green Global Future will follow and consider the developments on emission control areas. Then Dr. Sam Devin, Senior Specialist on Marine Conservation and Shipping with WWF Canada, will be the first of 2 speakers considering aspects of the use of scrubbers, and he will be followed by Anna Barford, Canada shipping campaigners with Stand.Earth, who will address measures in relation to the discharge of scrubber wastewater. Sarah Bobby of Ocean Conservancy's Arctic Program Senior Manager will speak on the work on underwater noise and will be followed by Amy Youngman, an international environmental attorney with the Environmental Investigation Agency, who will speak on the efforts to address reduction in shipping's marine plastic litter. Finally, we will come back to the work to address decarbonization with Anais Rios, Shipping Policy Officer with Seas at Risk on greenhouse gas emissions, followed by John Maggs with Ocean Conservancy and the Clean Shipping Coalition on energy efficiency and the carbon intensity indicator. Andrew Dumbrill from Equal Roots will wrap up the presentations focusing on the climate, biodiversity and pollution nexus. And we will then move straight into the Q&A session. So now let's get started, and I will pass the microphone to Bill Hemmings. Bill, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Ilko. Hi, everybody. MEPC will consider the regulation of Arctic ship black carbon emissions, this for the 21st time since deciding to act in 2011. 13 years later, no concrete reduction measure has been agreed, even though the Arctic faces catastrophic climate breakdown. Ship traffic is expanding rapidly there. Many are large vessels, tankers, bulkers, cargo, container ships, service vessels, all burning cheap residual fuel oil, emitting large amounts of black carbon, the most potent of short-lived climate forces. Yet the global shipping industry insists on being able to continue to operate in the Arctic uninhibited, depositing ship black carbon directly into the Arctic atmosphere and right onto sea ice and glaciers and snow. This surely is the height of irresponsibility. These larger ships, mainly owned by international operators, can cut black carbon emissions significantly by switching overnight to cleaner marine distillate fuels, already widely used globally and mandated in emission control areas. The additional fuel cost, about 20+% compared to VLSFO, is already passed on without so much as a murmur. The climate benefits of reduced BC are evident within days. Most of the many smaller fishing vessels in the Arctic already burn cleaner distillate fuel. Fuel consumption in the Arctic is just a tiny fraction of global ship fuel burn. Ship BC emissions do depend on engine size, operating condition, load and maintenance levels. Optimizing engines to cut pollution is, on the other hand, standard best practice. MEPC is expected to agree a resolution for individual ships to measure and record their Arctic BC emissions and even set individual ship reduction targets. But it'll take years to deliver results, especially as the program is voluntary. A fuel-based solution to cut Arctic ship B has been on the IMO table since 2012. Yet only in 2021 did IMO Resolution 34277 promote such a fuel switch, but only on a voluntary basis. Turkeys don't vote for Christmas, especially if money is involved. Second slide, please. The ENGO paper MEPC 8252 draws on impeccable advice from the marine fuel industry expressed at PPR 11 that switching from residuals to the distillate fuel DMA or its close cousin DMZ, which we could call polar fuels, will cut Arctic ship BC across the board and at varying rates depending on ship size and engine type. This is the oil industry saying it's a clear no-brainer, not complex and no new technology or expensive low zero carbon fuels needed. Clean fuels is a well-trodden path. Mandatory regulation of road fuel quality happened well over 20 years ago. There seems to be only one barrier standing in the way to mandatory action: the political will of the IMO and its member states, particularly those perhaps in Europe. Nearly 75% of the largest BC emitting ships in the Geo-Arctic, those over 5,000 gross tons, were involved in trade with EU in EEA ports in 2021. Industry also noted at PPR 11 that using these polar fuels would immediately address Norway and Iceland's concern about the grave environmental damage and cleanup challenges of Arctic spills of high pour point but low sulfur VLSFO and ULSFO residual fuels. Ruling out future use of residuals in favor of DMA and DMZ polar fuels would in no way restrict the use today of alternative low or zero carbon marine fuels, such as blends of biofuels with distillates, power to liquid fuels or other fuels, or even at this point, LNG. The BC reduction potential of these future fuels should, however, be verified via hydrogen to carbon ratio fuel testing, possibly in the context of developing a polar marine fuel standard. This work will take time and isn't needed now. It would only delay action. MEPC 8252 also notes that the concept of polar fuels could be deployed in the development of Arctic BC ECAs. Industry bodies like ISO develop marine fuel specs, such as the new version of ISO 8217. They underpin commercial contracts between fuel suppliers and users. Disputes on fuel quality are resolved commercially. They do not set pollution or fuel quality regulatory limits. Such regulation is the sole remit of states or of states working together at the IMO.
Need to wrap up, please.
So after 13 years of talk, you got to really ask yourself what's going on. Black carbon, like methane, is a potent short-lived climate forcer. The case for mandatory action on Arctic ship black carbon now is irrefutable. Thank you. I'll now pass to Kari.
Well, thank you very much. And I'll already go to next slide in respect of time, please. Air pollution from ships, both in ports and at sea, contributes significantly to ambient air pollution, leading both to nature destruction as well as health damages on land. Today, air pollution is, according to the World Health Organization, the main global risk factor in relation to mortality. More people die due to air pollution than people dying from tobacco smoking. Even in the European Union, air pollution causes around 8% of all deaths. So when we have 100 Europeans dying, 8 of their deaths can be directly related to diseases caused by air pollution. These are the official numbers from the European Environmental Agency. The World Bank has estimated that the health costs due to air pollution in the European Union has the same magnitude as 5% of GNP. Or in other words, air pollution is a huge burden upon our society. Not all air pollution is caused by shipping, but a significant part of the air pollution comes from shipping. And emission control areas limiting emissions of sulfur oxides, nitrogen oxides, fine particulate matter, as well as black carbon, have been the main IMO tool to reduce air pollution from shipping in sensitive regions. Next slide, please. There are several important points on the agenda in relation to emission control areas at MEPC 82. First of all, the adoption concerning designation of the Canadian Arctic and the Norwegian Sea as emission control areas as approved by MEPC 81 to enter into force on March 1st, 2026. Furthermore, we will have the first official IMO lunch break presentation concerning the designation of a North Atlantic emission control area, which could potentially be first proposed and approved already at MEPC 83 in the spring. If approved, the North Atlantic emission control area will be the largest geographically, closing the gap between the Canadian, the Norwegian, the Northern European, and the Mediterranean emission control areas. Next slide, please. So the expected outcomes, or what I personally would really like to see, is of course adopting the designation of the Canadian Arctic and Norwegian Sea as emission control areas.
1 minute.
On 1st of March 2026. And a clear commitment from Arctic coastal states concerning the designation of a North Atlantic emission control area, possibly to be proposed and approved already first time at MEPC 83 in the spring. So thank you very much. and I'll hand over the floor to Sam Davin from WWF to talk about scrubbers and legal matters.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Exhaust gas cleaning systems, otherwise known as scrubbers, are an immediate and ongoing threat to ocean health and the welfare of the people and wildlife who depend on it. Scrubbers are used by some operators to meet sulfur emission requirements without switching to cleaner, lower sulfur fuels. The result is a new form of marine pollution, so-called scrubber wastewater. It is the largest single stream of waste emitted by ships aside from ballast water. It is toxic to marine life, contributes to long-term food web impacts, and is accelerating ocean acidification even now as we speak. Ships using scrubbers in conjunction with heavy fuel oil also emit more particulate matter, black carbon, and GHGs than those using distillate fuels, as was identified by Canada in document PPR 9/INF.21. And, unlike lower sulfur fuels, scrubbers can break and they can malfunction, making them especially unfit for meeting the strict requirements of emission control areas. In short, they are a loophole technology that has enabled the shipping industry to reduce costs by shifting both risk and burden onto other ocean users. Next. MEPC 82 will consider scrubbers under Agenda Item 5. The committee will consider the outcomes of PPR 11, which featured extensive dialogue on scrubbers, including the remaining work under Output 1.23 on regulatory matters, which includes identifying and developing regulatory measures and instruments on scrubber discharges, recalling that to date, IMO has only developed non-binding guidelines. Two of the submissions inform the debate on regulatory matters by providing legal analyses on the scrubber issue. Regulation 4 of MARPOL Annex 6 provides for states to approve alternative compliance methods, but also entails an obligation to endeavor not to damage or impair the environment, human health, property, or resources. These submissions assert that scrubbers do not meet these requirements and therefore fail to qualify as acceptable alternatives to lower sulfur fuels. The key justifications outlined in these submissions are as follows. First, scrubbers reduce sulfur emissions but increase particulate matter, black carbon, and CO2 emissions. And when they fail to operate, no sulfur emission reductions are achieved. These implications pose significant health risks, such as lung disease and cancer, and worsen climate change, and therefore undermine the goal of MARPOL Annex 6 to reduce air pollution and protect human health and the environment. 2. Scrubbers generate a tremendous amount of water pollution and are not necessarily safe even when compliant with guidelines. They negatively affect water quality and marine life, including biological resources. And finally, the use of scrubbers contradicts international obligations, including those outlined in the Law of the Sea and human rights laws. While treaty interpretation is the prerogative of state parties, engaging in acts that defeat the object and purpose of a treaty undermines the rule of law. Next. WWF and the Clean Arctic Alliance are calling on the committee to consider the arguments presented in these documents and to initiate work to amend MARPOL Annex 6 to close the scrubber loophole, as well as to develop and adopt a resolution calling on operators to cease discharging scrubber waste in protected areas, critical habitat, and IMO special areas and PSSAs as a matter of priority and urgency. We are also calling on states to prohibit scrubber discharges in their jurisdictional waters and to immediately cease approving scrubbers for use on ships registered to their flags. Thank you. I'll be handing over to Anna Barford.
Good morning. Thank you, Sam. Hi, folks. My name is Anna Barford. I use she, her pronouns. I'm based out of Coast Salish Territories in Vancouver, Canada. I'm here to talk about scrubber discharges in a paper submitted to the upcoming IMO meeting. I do want to start by thanking Sean, who was instrumental in pulling this together, and of course the Clean Shipping Coalition, Pacific Environment, WWF, and Friends of the Earth International, who submitted the paper. Next slide, please. So we've submitted a summary of an ongoing process on exhaust gas cleaning systems, known as scrubbers, where Stand.Earth is alleging that Canada is in violation of our own species and ecosystem protection laws by allowing the discharge of scrubber wastewater following IMO rules. This means that there's a problem with species protection, as well as multilateral agreements that require them to enforce their own environmental protection rules. In this case, specifically CRISMA, an agreement formerly known as NAFTA, which is often a more popular name. So there are 3 points in the submission that I want for you to understand. The first one is that scrubber waste absolutely contain pollutants that are known to be harmful to fish and endangered whale species. Particularly of concern are top predators, fish species in the food web, including ones consumed by humans like salmon. I've had a couple pieces of salmon this week. And the endangered species like southern resident killer whales, of which there are only 74 remaining in the wild. There's a specific recovery plan for southern resident killer whales that names pollution and contaminants in their ecosystem, some of which are found in scrubber wastewater. The second thing to understand is that there is an incredible volume of discharge, and that discharge is growing. So in 2019, there were 44 million tons discharged in the waters off Canada's westernmost coast. That volume doubled in 2022 to 88 million tons annually. So according to Canada, scrubber wastewater is a significant source of the contaminant loading in southern resident killer whale critical habitat. And this makes a lot of sense because shipping lanes on popular cruise ship routes do zigzag all the way through the home of these incredibly endangered whales. The third thing that I want for you to understand is that Canada's fisheries laws do, in theory, protect whales and fish habitat. There's a law that specifically states that materials deleterious to fish shall not be deposited in their habitat. But because of IMO policies, scrubber wastewater that we know to be harmful is being deposited. And that contradiction is the issue. Next slide, please. So when it comes to the upcoming meeting, our ideal outcome is that MEPC bring in a resolution to stop the release of these discharges in areas that have been identified for their sensitivity, vulnerability, or conservation values. Of course, banning of this harmful pollution everywhere, as water does not know borders and pollution does not need a passport. That's the long-term goal, and that will ultimately be the best for the ecosystems and the food web. But reducing loading immediately in sensitive and food harvest areas would be very helpful right away. And so I'll say thank you so much. I think we're taking questions at the end, and I'll happily pass to the next presenter, Sarah.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Bobby, and I'm with Ocean Conservancy. I'm based in Anchorage, Alaska on Dena'ina lands. And I'm going to cover Agenda Item 9, reduction of underwater radiated noise from ships. Next slide, please. I'd like to start by showing you all that the Clean Arctic Alliance has an infographic on the impacts of underwater noise and what could be done to reduce it. Underwater noise interferes with a variety of marine species. For example, it hinders the ability of marine mammals to transmit and receive acoustic information, which may lead to difficulty communicating, finding prey, resting, avoiding hazards, etc. And while there are naturally occurring as well as other anthropogenic sounds in the ocean, vessel traffic is a key source of harmful underwater noise. Now, most of the noise from a vessel is due to propeller cavitation. Next slide, please. A combination of ship design, ship maintenance, and policy solutions can decrease underwater noise and its harmful impacts. For example, existing vessels can install quieter propellers, maintain polish, clean hulls and propellers, insulate engines, or easiest of all, slow down to reduce noise. Next slide, please. So moving on to the work at the IMO, which is occurring because of the aforementioned threat and the need to address it. In 2014, at its 66th session, the IMO approved guidelines to reduce underwater radiated noise from ships. And it was found after that there was little to no uptake of these guidelines. And so a few years back, the IMO was tasked with revising the guidelines and developing an action plan to further reduce noise. Now, the revised guidelines were approved at MEPC 80, as were the guidelines for underwater radiated noise reduction in Inuit, Nunat, and the Arctic, which is MEPC 1 Circular 907. Now at MEPC 81, an action plan was endorsed and a 3-year experience building phase draft guidance was approved. So now we are currently in this experience building phase for the guidelines and are starting to tackle the action plan. Now at this MEPC 82, we want to be sure that we continue to have momentum forward with getting the most out of the 3-year experience building phase and tackling the action plan. And while we don't foresee any issue in this happening at MEPC, as there's likely broad support for the way forward stated in MEPC 82.9, which is a great thing. This includes URN being on the agenda of MEPC 82 through MEPC 85 to promote greater access to knowledge and research on URN and to encourage wide participation in the information sharing. I'd also like to highlight that many members of the Clean Arctic Alliance sponsored MEPC 82.97, which summarized available resources and information to assist the shipping industry with uptake of the revised guidelines.
One minute, please.
Yeah, thank you. And before I conclude, I would just like to say that noise reduction measures are not in isolation of other issues discussed in this webinar. And for example, many energy efficiency measures also lead to a reduction in noise. So we're excited to hear more about that and later in the seminar. And next slide. And yeah, finally, I'd like to highlight that there is a noise side event at MEPC Thursday at 1:30. And I'll go ahead and pass this on to Amy.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. My name is Amy Youngman. I work for EIA as members of Clean Shipping Coalition. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak today. If you could go to the next slide. So today I'm going to be speaking on agenda item 8, follow-up work emanating from the action plan to address marine plastic litter from ships. You may remember I spoke about some of these same documents ahead of MEPC 81. Back then, we were urging the Secretariat to review the action plan as was originally intended in 2023. For a little bit of extra context, the action plan was adopted in 2018 and set out 30 actions to be completed by 2025, aimed at achieving zero plastic waste discharges from ships and aligned with Sustainable Development Goal 14. And importantly, that action plan included a built-in review mechanism stating that its effectiveness would be assessed by 2023. However, at MEPC 81, outside of adopting recommendations for handling plastic pellets in freight containers by sea, most of the work on plastic was deferred to MEPC 82, including this review of the action plan. So ahead of this meeting, we've heard that the focus will be on greenhouse gas emissions, which is great, but all substantive discussions on plastic pollution is likely to be pushed to PPR. So while we did receive a review from the Secretariat in document MEPC 82-8, there's only a plenary discussion planned for it. So Clean Shipping Coalition has submitted 5 papers with other sign-ons, particularly from Friends of Earth International, on this topic, but unfortunately no other organizations or member states have made submissions. So there's a concern that there won't be substantial momentum on this issue. Next slide, please. And while there has been progress, particularly on fishing gear and plastic pellets, many actions under the plan are still incomplete. And worse, new sources of microplastic pollution, such as rope abrasion, anti-fouling paints, and fiberglass from vessel maintenance continue to emerge. We believe that these issues are critical and need to be addressed to achieve the zero plastic pollution goal by 2025. And so we're pushing for more ambition in areas like standards for rope maintenance and stricter controls on gray water discharges, which are significant sources of microplastic pollution. We also highlight the need for stronger enforcement of MARPOL Annex 5, which governs waste management on ships. Illegal discharges of plastic waste continue despite existing regulations. So we really need to enhance enforcement and make port reception facilities a bit better to properly address this. Additionally, while the action plan has made some progress on plastic pellets, it's time to move away from voluntary measures, and we really need mandatory regulations on packaging, stowage, and loss response protocols. Unfortunately, some countries argue that this is outside of the scope of PPR because it's not explicitly in the action plan. A bit ironic because it's the one thing that we have really accomplished within the action plan. But we deem that as necessary to amend the action plan to include these measures. So in conclusion, at MEPC 82, the committee must not only assess the completion of the plan's actions, but also determine whether they are actually delivering the intended outcomes. Importantly, there has been no assessment of the impact or an evaluation of the effectiveness of the actions taken. So we're really urging the committee to ensure that these actions lead to meaningful reductions in marine plastic litter rather than just ticking boxes. Last slide, please. Just wanted to thank you for your time, and I hope that we can achieve something real in London, and I won't be back talking about more of these same documents at MEPC 83, but I'll now pass it on to Anise. Thank you.
Thank you. You can go next. So what is the basket of measures? As you all know, in 2023, the IMO committed to reach net zero by or around 2050. So how will that happen? Partly through the basket of measures, which are to be developed and finalized by 2025 and enter into force in 2027. Next. The basket of measures is comprised of both technical elements, namely a goal-based marine fuel standard, regulating the phase reduction of the marine fuel's GHG intensity, and an economic element based off a marine GHG emission pricing mechanism, for example, a levy. So if appropriately designed, the measures should promote the energy transition of shipping and provide the world fleet a needed incentivization while contributing to a level playing field and a just and equitable transition. To feed into the negotiations, the IMO has undertaken a comprehensive impact assessment of the potential impacts of the proposed measures. This is done by external contractors and will be crucial for the upcoming negotiations next week and inform on key elements. Next. Now, what is the best combination for the basket of measures? Next. What the numbers show is that what is most needed is first understanding that the IMO has to couple the basket of measures with the requirement of improving energy efficiency of the global fleet, for example, through the carbon intensity indicator. This will mean ships deploying wind technology en masse and slowing their operating speeds. Then the transition will be faster, easier, and cheaper. When it comes more specifically to the basket of measures, the global fuel standard being designed now will require ships to use fuel that emit fewer well-to-wake emissions until there is complete transition. This is meant to encourage the uptake of zero-emission fuels by setting limits on the GHG emission intensity of fuels. It will drive investment in both the production capacity and the infrastructures. Now, we are asking for four main things, which is one, a reward factor mechanism, also known as a non-fuel multiplier, for the use of zero emission on board non-fuel energy sources, such as wind or solar. Then a reward mechanism for a fuel multiplier for the use of alternative fuels based on electrolytic hydrogen. Also requirement for the use of a minimum amount of alternative fuels, and then a specific criteria to define what are zero and near zero emissions fuels. For the levy, it is crucial to adopt an ambitious enough levy to allow, through a just distribution, a rebalance of impact in order to reduce inequities and allow that no country and no one is left behind. A high enough levy will also ensure the reduction of the costs of the transition for both the people, the industry, and the countries. Next. So that is just thank you to you. And I will now pass it to John. Go ahead, John.
Thank you, Anais. Thank you very much. And thank you for providing a little bit of an intro for the carbon intensity indicator. So yes, I mean, before I say why it's important, I guess I should explain what it is. I mean, it's the IMO's. I mean, we've been hearing recently a lot about the medium-term measures, the basket of measures that Anaïs just described, but the carbon intensity is part of a group of measures, of short-term measures that were agreed some time ago, and you will probably have come across it in the form of a kind of A to E scoring of ships' operational efficiency, and this, you know, ships are keeping track of their fuel consumption and the distance they travel, and they're reporting this, and then they're being given a score. That's it. You know, that's the bare bones of the carbon intensity indicator. But of course, its purpose is to drive improvements in the energy efficiency of ships. And why is this important? Well, quite put very simply, it is impossible to meet the IMO's recently enhanced climate ambition without the CII driving improved energy efficiency. I mean, one of the problems that we have is that, I mean, there's a lot of emphasis on fuels, and people are very interested in alternative fuels, but these are not going to come online quickly enough. Certainly for the 2030 targets that the IMO have agreed, and you'll remember that Anaïs mentioned, going to zero by 2050, but emissions are supposed to drop by 30% by 2030 and 80% by 2040. So there's some really heavy lifting going on in the short term, and these reductions are just not possible without emission reductions as a result of improvements in energy efficiency. And it's the CII that can drive that, that could drive that. It could, in short, actually deliver almost half of the necessary emission reductions out to 2050. So we're imagining it being able to contribute perhaps 75% of the emission reductions to 2030, perhaps around a half at 2040, and maybe a quarter at 2050. So, a very, very significant, without these emission reductions, these targets are not going to be met. The CII is important because there are barriers to a lot of existing operational practices and technologies. And this is just things that the shipping industry could do right now, but isn't doing for various reasons. The CII process can dismantle those barriers and get these things happening really quickly, much quicker than new fuels coming in. Of course, the reason the CII works so well is because it reduces fuel burn. And this is important because, we want to reduce fossil fuel burn now because of fossil emissions, carbon emissions, but there are also issues around new fuels, and we're going to want to keep the burning of those new fuels to a minimum as well. So, the CII reduces fuel burn, and this is going to help ensure the least cost decarbonisation of shipping. It's also going to help avoid the use of, valuable, scarce, renewable electricity to create e-fuels. So, there's lots of talk about e-fuels, but, you make e-fuels by using renewable electricity. It's a very energy-intensive process. Renewable electricity is in short supply, will continue to be in short supply. We're going to need these fuels for shipping, but we can't use them wastefully. So, keeping fuel burn down, even when these new fuels are online, is going to be really important. Next slide, please, Sylvette. So what's happening at the IMO? Thank you. What's happening at the IMO? Well, the problem with the CII at the moment is it's weak and lacks enforcement. The revision process for this starts at MEPC 82 and must conclude before the end of 2026. There's already lots of manoeuvring going on, arguments about why we can't revise the CII now, or why we don't have time. But the CII can be fixed. All we have to do is separate the real issues from the special pleading. But without a strong CII, the GFS and the levy will only fix half of shipping's climate problem. So to summarize, without a strong revised carbon intensity indicator from 2026, the IMO and the shipping industry will not be able to meet their climate targets. The cost of the shipping industry's energy transition will be higher than it needs to be. Important environmental co-benefits, especially those stemming from lower speeds and wind, will be missed. And the extra unnecessary demand for e-fuels in shipping will risk slowing down the wider decarbonisation of the economy. CII often appears the poor relation in the shipping climate talks, but the role that it has in driving deep and lasting improvements in ship energy efficiency couldn't be more important. And this will become centre stage for the climate talks at MEPC 82. And on that, I'll pass the mic to Andrew. Thank you.
Thanks very much, John. And it's a really great segue at the end. John talked about co-benefits. And the shipping nexus issue is all about co-benefits. Next slide, Sylvette. Yeah, thanks, Sylvette, for being the ghost of the machine today and doing all that work behind the scenes and organizing the webinar, of course. So this is the intersectionality of shipping, especially as it corresponds to the triple planetary crisis. And so you'll see the Venn diagram here. This was a diagram that was done up by Equal Roots for a report we wrote on this issue. And you know, the sweet spot where that overlap is really what this issue is about. It's the interconnection, it's the linkages, it's the coupling of these issues. And what underpins this is the core of this is the recognition that a healthy and diverse ocean plays a pivotal role in tackling the climate crisis. The ocean has the ability to soak up 31% of global CO2 emissions and produces half of the planet's oxygen. So if you have a healthy ocean, you go a long way to tackling the triple planetary crisis and the climate crisis. Next slide. And so NGOs, including FOEI and Pacific Environment and CSC, put in submission 82710 to this meeting, and that summarizes this intersectionality issue and looks at all those various impacts and solutions from the shipping sector. And that's really important around the solutions piece, because it looks at the co-benefits of emission control areas, of particularly sensitive sea areas, of reducing pollution, and how those very familiar and singular measures can actually feed into solutions around the triple planetary crisis. And so this paper recommends two things. It recommends, first of all, at a higher level, leveling up biodiversity and pollution to climate. Right now, and as it should be, the IMO and MEPC will be gripped and focused on reducing climate and developing, further developing the revised 2023 strategy. And this isn't about bringing down the capacity around climate. It's about bringing up the recognition, the awareness, the focus on pollution and biodiversity, not only for their own right, obviously, but how they contribute to the triple planetary crisis and to fighting climate change. The second recommendation of this paper is for a high-level task force, similar to what was struck for the Just Transition Task Force, to explore this intersectionality, to explore the co-benefits solution space, what we're calling the co-benefit solution space, and prioritize measures that tackle the triple planetary crisis. Next slide, please. And a great complement to this, it wasn't necessarily planned, although we did have some discussions around it, is the Convention on Biological Diversity has submitted an INF paper, MEPC 82 INF 35, which is connecting the agenda of the Global Biodiversity Framework with the IMO. And so it's very concrete and explicit on the biodiversity agenda and what those linkages could be and should be, and calls for more integration. That's what this paper calls for. And the task force, which is recommended in the NGO paper, is a perfect way to serve the CBD's recommendation. It's to explore those linkages and to develop common frameworks to meet the CBD targets as well as the mandate of the IMO. Next slide, please. Just quickly to mention, there's a tipping points paper, MEPC 82717, which is a really great paper looking at, obviously, we passed thresholds and we're in danger of passing more, but it also gets into positive tipping points. And in a lot of ways, the intersectionality or the nexus shipping issue is creating a positive tipping points to move us in a direction to address the triple planetary crisis. Next slide. And on this slide, underwater noise, and Sarah did a great job of outlining it, is a really great example of an issue that really is at the intersection in the shipping sector. So an efficient ship, a slower ship, reduces greenhouse gas emissions, whale strikes, and underwater noise. And so if you look at an issue like slow steaming or speed reductions, if you prioritize that issue, you actually tackle all three all at once. And that's what this agenda is about, is creating a co-benefit solution space. So we prioritize and we put resources into those issues that cross between all three. Next slide. And this is from the Shipping Pact for People. The Equal Routes and others created this report. And whenever you say, well, what can the shipping do in this intersectional space and to tackle a triple planetary crisis? And we outlined an agenda, which is slowing down, more mission control areas, more PSSAs, efficient ships, ramping up efficient ships, and eradicating pollution. Next slide. So, and all these measures are familiar. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. We just need to prioritize and level up pollution and biodiversity to what we're seeing on climate right now. These are some resources that can help with that. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you for all the speakers today. That was indeed a whistle-stop tour of the issues on the agenda of MEPC 82. And we have time for a couple of quick questions before we conclude. And I think there's a recent question coming in from Isabella Koschnik. I hope I pronounced that in the right way. And she says, I couldn't agree more. The submission is highly important. My question is, how can we also integrate human rights into this intersectional approach? Well, it reminded me a bit of that, sometimes when you speak with people in the maritime industry, they consider the ocean as a sort of a blue highway. But I think there's a lot of educating to do in this sector to just say, well, this is not just a highway. It's an ecosystem or a bundle of ecosystems where there's a lot happening and which has many more values than just transportation. So, Andrew, maybe you could answer that question.
Yeah, thanks, Ilko, and thanks, Isabella. It's a great question. In the Navigating the Future report, which is the Shipping Pact for People and Nature, where that is coming from, the foundation of the pact, or the foundation of a new look at biodiversity and pollution and climate, or these intersectional issues, is the pillars of that are just and equitable transition, and safety and human rights of seafarers. And we can't move into this new space without those pillars in place. And the other connected issue here is that obviously pollution affects coastal communities. And if you reduce that pollution, it safeguards food security and livable communities. So the people part of this equation, Shipping Pact for People and Nature, is really integral into getting this nexus issue right. And if you focus on issues like emission control areas, especially in the Arctic, they touch on climate, habitat, and as we heard, health issues. So the people piece is very important to that agenda. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Andrew. Now, there's also a couple of questions about scrubbers, which is apparently a popular topic in this session. So, most of them have been answered, but I'm not sure, Sam, if you can elaborate a bit more on the questions that were raised.
Hi, Elko. Certainly, yeah. So we received several questions in the chat regarding impact of using a scrubber on carbon emissions, particulate matter emissions, as well as the toxicity and impacts of scrubber discharges on aquatic biota. So just to revisit those responses, first, yes, to clarify, using a scrubber in conjunction with heavy fuel oil does result in greater emissions of particulate matter, including black carbon, a significant short-lived climate forcer that we heard about earlier during Bill's presentation, as well as an overall greater burden of carbon dioxide emissions. That work was outlined in a document submitted to IMO by Canada several sessions ago to the Pollution Prevention and Response Subcommittee, and is supported by work conducted by the ICCT. And on the second point regarding the toxicity and impacts of scrubber wash water to wildlife, yes, there is a burgeoning body of scientific research that indicates that scrubber wash water is indeed horrible for marine wildlife. We have seen demonstrated that scrubber wash water is acutely toxic to marine zooplankton, which make up the base of the marine food web and therefore imperil all ocean wildlife. And we also see that, in particular, juvenile organisms are particularly susceptible to the negative impacts of scrubber wash water. Even at concentrations of equal to 1 milliliter per 1 ton of seawater, significant negative impacts were observed, and this was recorded and reported by the folks working as part of the Emerge project. And I know that I will trip up right now on the acronym, but the European initiative that has done a lot of good work to date looking at impacts of scrubber wash water. And finally, I'd say that MEPC 82 was an excellent opportunity to advance the dialogue around these concerns. We saw a significant swell of support for taking real action on the issue of scrubbers at PPR 11 and going into PPR 12, where there's an open call for proposals on how to best manage the issue of regulatory matters. The dialogue that happens at MEPC 82 is a real opportunity to shape that. So I'll leave it there, but happy to answer any follow-on questions.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. And then I see Cora's hand. Maybe you want to elaborate on scrubbers, or is that
just very briefly to say that in Denmark we will from next summer have a total ban on discharge of scrubber water. Sweden will do the same. And this is based on a quite comprehensive impact assessment showing that scrubbers are a significant source to both heavy metals and pHs in the marine environment. And both heavy metals and pHs, they will, of course, heavy metals will live forever, but pHs have a very long lifetime as well. So they will accumulate in the marine environment and cause toxic effects.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And then there's a couple of questions about the cruise industry and about fuels. I think for Anna, there's a question, is there a reason that the US port terminal tariff can only prohibit discharges and not the actual type of fuel? I think this is an issue that is happening in more areas, that ports can take measures, take their own measures. So Anna, do you have can you answer this question?
Well, I can certainly try. Thank you. We see this thing where people that are close to the coast, ports, communities are concerned about scrubber discharges, and so we're seeing more action from ports than we are from state governments. And so one of the things when it comes to fuel is that states like to maintain control of the ability for ships to choose a variety of fuels. So that does mean a limiting of powers for ports in smaller places. That doesn't mean that we can't still be effective in fighting sort of scrubber wastewater, and that discharge bans aren't necessarily lacking in terms of efficiency, in terms of protecting those species that are sensitive to them, in terms of helping our communities out and reducing pollution. The most efficient thing would be for states and for the IMO just to ban the use of scrubbers and heavy fuel oil everywhere. But as we get a patchwork and regions that are controlling for these wastes, that also will help put the squeeze on vessels that want to use and want to pollute in these ways.
Okay, thank you. And then there was also a question that was partly answered by John But maybe you want to elaborate a bit more. There's always a question about green fuel as an alternative to heavy fuel oil.
Well, yeah, since we have time, I don't mind saying a few more words. But yeah, I mean, I think there is, of course, a lot of speculation. Purely from an environmental point of view, there are problems with biofuels. So I think it's not that there aren't going to be biofuels in the mix at some point, maybe more so early on, but there are really serious sustainability and scalability issues that are going to stop biofuels from being anything like a proper alternative fuel in the future for shipping, or indeed for many other users. So we're sort of everybody's very much focused on hydrogen derived e-fuels, ammonia, e-methanol, that kind of thing. And of course, these all have one thing in common, and that is that for them to be properly sustainable long term, they have to be made from renewable electricity. Renewable, there's lots of ways of using renewable electricity, when the world is decarbonizing. And using it to create synthetic fuels is really quite an energy intensive process, and one could argue quite a wasteful process. So you will find, as well as within the environmental world, you'll find, of course, we're going to need alternative zero carbon fuels in the future. But these fuels have their own problems too, and we need to keep the burning of them down to a minimum, which is, I think, why Elko asked me to answer this, because it sort of takes us back to the carbon intensity indicator, but also to the fuel standard, where as Anais said, we're arguing very strongly for a factor in the GFS to incentivize wind over new fuels. So it's kind of, in many respects, it's a sort of shipping industry climate superpower, the ability to set sails on your ship. At the moment, that's looking like it's going to be a bit niche, but actually it could be mainstream, and it could result in us needing dramatically less of these very expensive, well, they will be very expensive as well, but also very energy intensive new fuels. So yeah, difficult to say what the synthetic fuel is going to be at the end of the day, but it will be an e-fuel of some kind, and let's just hope we can organize the decarbonisation process and organize the regulatory platform to make sure that we need as little of it as possible.
Thank you. So we only have a few minutes left, but I saw that both Sam and Cor had their hands up, and there was a new question about the scrubber discharge. So Sam, I'm not sure if you wanted to respond to that.
I'd be happy to, Elko. I'd also like to add to the comments that Anna previously made around bans. We know from work that we have submitted to IMO and that was produced by ICCT in summer 2023, that even at that time, there are 93 bans and restrictions across 45 countries, and that's only grown in the year since that work was conducted. Even sitting here in Canada, where I am, 5 out of the 17 federal port authorities have taken actions to restrict the use of scrubbers within their own jurisdictional waters. With respect to the question in the chat about if scrubber discharge is banned, won't the scrubber water just be pumped to shore? I mean, the answer is, in my view, no. The majority of ships using scrubbers are using open loop scrubbers, which produce such a volume of waste that there is absolutely no feasible way for that waste to be retained on a ship. The whole way the open loop scrubber functions is to continuously discharge that waste directly into the ocean. For those that are using closed loop scrubbers, it's possible that they could retain the water that they're using on board for a period of time, but even that needs to be periodically refreshed. And so it would pose a significant challenge for a ship using only closed loop scrubber to discharge their waste to an onshore facility that frequently. There's also the question of which ports are equipped to receive that bleed off water as well as the resulting sludge. So that's how I would approach that question. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. And then Cor, maybe just very briefly.
I'll do it very briefly and just back up John and say that transforming our renewable electricity to shipping fuel is probably the worst thing we can do. We get 6 times as high climate benefit CO2 saving by using it in a heat pump and 3 times as much by using it in an electric vessel. And it'll take decades before we have sufficient surplus electricity to waste it for power to X fuel. So I fully agree. This is not going to happen. We need energy savings. That's the way forward in shipping and many other sectors as well.
Yeah, and you could also say, sort of say that scrubbers are an alibi to continue using heavy fuel oil. Okay, well, thank you to all the speakers. And yeah, our time is up and we must conclude our discussion here today. Today's presentations have raised a wide range of issues, and clearly much more needs to be done to reduce the impact of international shipping on the ocean, and in particular on the Arctic. As I said at the start, it is our intention to make the recording of this event available online via our website, and the details will be circulated in due course. And may I once again thank you all the speakers, Bill, Cor, Sam, Anna, Sarah, Amy, Anais, John and Andrew. And of course, also people behind the scenes, Sylvette and Sean, and our communications guy, Dave Walsh. And I would also like to thank those behind the scenes and that made the webinars possible. And thank you, the participants. We had more than 80 today. And I do hope that everyone will help to make progress on these issues during MEPC 82. So thank you and goodbye, and maybe we'll see each other in London.